Working with Ionic gives our application a certain structure known as MVC, or Model View Controller. The model refers to the data that you can use in an application. The view is the template, and the controller is the JavaScript that ties the model to the view. Now that put together makes up an entire application. Now we've already got a template or view, but we need to add a model or data and tie it up with a controller. Before we can do that, we're going to need some assets. So I'm going to need a data file that I can read, and you can get it at this URL. And what you want to do is make sure that you click on this raw button. And I'm going to save this. So I'll go to the File menu and select Save Page As. Let's go ahead and put it on the desktop. And we're going to call it data.json. So I'm going to open up the My App folder, find the www folder, and then open up the JS folder and move this data.json file in there. We're also going to need some photos. Now, if you have access to the exercise files for this project, you can get them from there. Otherwise, you can use your own photos or just use a placeholder site like placehold.it. So I'm going to move these into the www folder and inside the img folder. I'm going to open this up first and just grab all these images. I don't need this Ionic one. It's already there. And then move these photos in here. And then I can get rid of this folder. Now, if these assets look familiar, they're the same assets that I use in my course called Up and Running with AngularJS. If you don't have a lot of experience with AngularJS, this is a great course to get you started. The easiest way to load data is to use the Angular HTTP service. It's pretty easy to do. However, you want to make sure that you start up your application using the Ionic serve command. So that has been running in the background. Let's go ahead and quit that here. If it's not running, just go ahead and run the Ionic serve command. It should open a browser window with your application running in it. Loading data requires a connection to a server. So just drag in an HTML file like this index.html document into your browser. It's not going to work. So the first thing we need to do is load up the controller into the JavaScript file for this program. So if you look at the very top of this document, you can see that we're loading a number of things, including the app.js file that's in the JS folder. So if we find that, you can see the default code that is added when we use the blank template in Ionic. So what we need to do is add a controller to this module. So we've started a module right here. And right here, we have some default functionality that you are not going to change. But after that, we're going to need to add a controller. And we're going to do so right here. We'll say controller. And this controller is going to be called a list controller. And into this controller, we're going to read some dependencies. So, of course, we're always going to need scope, which is the local store of all the variables in an AngularJS application. And since we need to load up some files, we're going to need to ask for the HTTP service in this controller. In addition to that, we're going to need a function right here. It's going to be a function literal, and it's going to get scope as well as the HTTP service. And then in here, we're going to use the HTTP service to get a file that is going to be located in the JavaScript folder, and it's going to be called data.json. Now, if that is successful, so we can call this success method, then we're going to execute a function, and that function is going to pass along some data. Let's make this a little wider so we can see more of it. And what we're going to do here is just pass along the data that we get from the HTTP service into a scope variable called artists. That's really all we need. We just need a couple of other semicolons right here to close things up properly. And we're going to save this. It's not really going to do anything to our application just yet. Next up, we need to show our list. And to do that, we're going to need to go back into the index.html document and find a place where we are listing, which is this ion list right here, our items. Right now, we've got placeholder information in there. So this is the time that we're going to modify this so that it puts in actual data from our file. First up, though, in this ion content, we also need to refer to the controller that we created in the app.js file. So somewhere in this Ion content tag, we're going to need to say ng controller, and that's going to be equal to the list controller that we just created. So next up in this list of items that we create right here, we're going to need to add an ng repeat command. So we'll say something like ng repeat. It's going to be equal to something here, which is going to be item in artists. So remember, we are inserting the information from the database. If we take a look at this, we're putting all the information that we get from the HTTP service into this variable called artists. So right now, what we're doing is saying, I want you to go through this list of artists and do something with them. So now instead of using placeholder information for this image, we can actually use the data from the JSON file. So let me open that up in this other tab here so we can kind of see the information that we can get. So we have a name that we can use, which is the name of the person. Then we have something called short name, and this is pretty much the same thing as the name, but these spaces have been converted to underscores. Also, some of these artists have more than two names, like Jonathan G. Farrar. So you'll see that the names are sort of truncated to just be two names and then an underscore in between them. I use that information to refer to the images because they're named with the short name. So if you open up the images here on the left, you can see that they're named with the short version of the names. So we're going to ask Ionic to go to the image folder, and then using the Angular templating language, we're going to add for an item short name, which is the short name right here. And the reason we're saying item over here is because we've taken all the artists, and as Angular is navigating through this list, it's going to store the current artist in a variable called item. So let me go ahead and move this over so we can see it better. Actually, let's go ahead and just put these tabs next to each other so we can have the full view, and we'll hide the sidebar for now. And then all the images have an underscore TN for thumbnail, and they all have the .jpg extension. And then here where we say photo, we're going to modify it to be item name and then the photo. So it'll get the name of the person and then add photo right next to it. Right, then we can add the rest of the template info here. So we can say item name, and instead of this right here, we can say item renown. And this one should be item, not iden. And then instead of using this dummy text here, we can say item.bio. And I'm going to go ahead and save that and reduce the size of the window here. And you should see the application have all of the user's information from the data file. The first step to working with data is importing the data and then building a controller that gives you access to that data in your template. Angular amplifies the power that is built into Ionic and makes it easier to build applications that can be controlled via JavaScript.